Thank you kindly, Eric. Thank you kindly, Eric, for this gracious introduction. And thank you, Joseph, also for helping me to set up, organize and publicize this event ahead of this presentation. And thank you all for being here today in this glorious day on Zoom to listen about manuscripts and palimpsests and the processing of these manuscripts. So I deeply appreciate the time that you are spending here with me and with us. As Eric mentioned, I am a medievalist. I'm also a comparativist. I am a CUNY alumna and CUNY faculty. So I will begin, I suppose, formally with my talk. I have prepared a PowerPoint, which I think I will begin to share now. And let me just for a minute kind of set up here, share my screen. Here we are. Okay. All right. So now I cannot see you, but I hope you can see my PowerPoint. Okay. Now I can see you somewhat. Just a minute. I'm sorry for this setup. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yes. Do I have a thumbs up from anyone? Okay. I assume you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, okay, I got you, Eric. So thank you. My name again is Christina Christoforatou, and I'm a literary scholar of ancient and medieval texts here at CUNY at Baruch College. I'm a medievalist and a comparativist in the Department of English. My research interests range broadly over medieval cultural poetics, Byzantine intellectual history, and expressions of power in medieval and Renaissance texts. In the past 5 years, my scholarship has culminated in a series of articles and an edited book that examines the institutional symbolic relationship of literature to politics. Somehow I have gravitated in these relationships, whether I examine medieval Greek texts or Western European texts in an array of languages. Alongside my interest in medieval poetics, I nourish an interest in power and sexuality, as those two are manifested in Western European fictional and non-fictional texts. In 2010, I collaborated with a medieval historian from the University of Texas at Austin to produce a study of medieval gender and sexuality, which was published by the University of Texas Press under the title Desire and Eroticism in Medieval Europe, 11th to 15th Centuries, Sex Without Sex. Since then, I have turned my sights to the study of romance as a genre and its development in Byzantium. The 9 original romances that survive from the Greek Middle Ages represent the rebirth of creative fiction in the form of the novel after a disruption of more than 800 years. They also exhibit the most creative qualities of the genre since late antiquity and are thought to have influenced the development of romance in Western Europe. The composition of the first 4 novels coincides with the visit of the great patron of the arts to Constantinople, Eleanor of Aquitaine, with the Knights of the Fourth Crusade in 1147. During her visit, Eleanor had the opportunity to hear 2 of these romances recited in the imperial court of Manuel Comnenus. And these 2 are the novel by Theodore Prodromos, Rhodanthe and Dosicles, and the novel by Constantine Manassas, Aristandor's Califea. In my recent monograph, it's a monograph manuscript, I examine all 9 romances as a genre. I approach their narratives as a discursive site of contestation, a site where literary, religious, and political issues are actively debated, argued, and negotiated. In each of these texts, I engage with what I call the reconstructive power of desire. This is a term that I developed from my earlier study of the genre in Western European contexts. I argue that desire informs the reader of the presence of eroticism in religious and secular communities, and further invites readers of all times, not only medieval readers, to consider the varying and ever-shifting boundaries of desire across space, cultures, and time. Medieval Romance participates in this way in the definition and critique of established norms. In the context of the narrative of these romances, this has shown the propensity of the author to reinvent and criticize political action. And this happens through discussions that the principal characters have with one another, in dreams, in reflections, and through other means as well as through art. Today, I want to share with you two recent developments in medieval literary studies that speak to the centrality of fiction and romance in particular in Byzantine life. Both of these developments invite cross-disciplinary conversations around issues that are central to romance as a genre, issues such as power, identity, possession and dispossession, and I believe remain important to us today as well as they engage with nature, ecology, spirituality, art, as well as transcendence. I have divided my talk into 5 parts, which I outline in the following slide. But before I kind of get there, I want to say a few things about the romances, the kind of titles that you see on this particular slide. Generally, we have more than the romances that I list here, but what I list here, what are they? 1, 2, 3, 4. The 9 romances that you see here, 4 novels, Byzantine is called the first 4 novels, the ones that follow romances, are original compositions. We also have a number, about 6 or 7, that are translations or adaptations of Western and Persian romances. But my focus is overwhelmingly on these original compositions. So I will come back to these categories and refer to the first 4 as novels, to the second revival of the genre as romances, as they're referenced. There is a kind of a break between the 2 revivals of about 75 or 80 years. And the evidence that I'm going to report on, the manuscript evidence from the Sinai Monastery, allows us as scholars to see a sort of continuity between the importance of the genre and its development between the first period and the second, the 12th century, from the 12th century to the 14th. So my talk and what's to follow. I have divided my talk into 5 parts, which I outline on this slide. In the first 3 parts, I address the Sinai Palimpsests Project, which is a collaboration among 3 institutions. I outline its scope, report on recent finds, and reflect on their importance. I also show how recent advances in science and scholarship enable researchers like me to reconstruct the history and travels of material objects, such as the palimpsests in question, and also ask what objects like the manuscript that concerns me can tell us about the interactions between Western medieval and Byzantine cultures. In the last 2 parts, I focus on a single discovery from this project, a medieval palimpsest that preserves erotic poetry in Greek. This discovery, I argue, offers proof of the centrality of fiction in Byzantine life from the 12th century on, both in Constantinople and outside of its bounds, in the periphery of the empire, in North Africa, as well as on Mount Sinai, in the Monastery of St. Catherine. Before I transition to the project itself, I want to speak briefly about the Monastery of St. Catherine, its location, its holdings, and the work currently underway on its palimpsests. The Digitation Manuscript Project is part of an ambitious collaborative project that is in its very early stages. The research is currently on the second phase, which has only been introduced through verbal reports. So what I'm going to share with you next has not appeared in print anywhere. What we know about this project has come from the very generous sharing of various finds from the director of the project, Dr. Claudia Rapp from the University of Vienna, and other scholars who are working alongside with her, scientists as well as experts who are handling the technology. They usually sort of travel like a group, and they give updates and conferences and the invitation of various universities. Next, the monastery. So the monastery of St. Catherine is located on the Sinai Peninsula. It is tucked into a valley of at the foot of Mount Sinai and was built in the 6th century on the orders of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. It is the oldest continually occupied monastery and the oldest operating library in the world. Its holdings are only second to the Vatican Library, and among the thousands of ancient parchments in its collection are at least 160 palimpsests, which hold text in long-lost languages and have almost entirely vanished from the historical record. In some cases, the erased texts have increased the non-vocabulary of a language by up to 50%. This, of course, welcome news to linguists who are trying to decipher them. And I will report soon on the linguistic findings that have been yielded through their study. Palimpsests are ancient manuscripts with a twist. They're made from parchment, which renders them enduring. But they're also susceptible to recycling in that, they may be reused. And so they're the kinds of documents that monastic communities and owners love to have, but oftentimes they became, subject to reuse, and therefore the information that was originally recorded disappeared. Palimpsests are made of animal skins that were soaked in lime and then stretched on a frame and sheared until smooth and even. Because the production of parchment, however, was a highly specialized craft, it was expensive and sometimes difficult to find. If a scribe needed to write a text, but there was no parchment available, he would likely turn to a manuscript that was considered unimportant or less important, erase the text, and write the new text over the old. Now, this is a good example of a loosely assembled palimpsest that preserves text in Arabic and has been used and reused. So what is legible to us is the overtext, but with proper processing, there are layers of text underneath that. Similarly, when the need for a new text outweighed the value of the usefulness of an older manuscript, a scribe would disassemble the older codex, with the new text written over the old. The erased layer of writing is normally faintly visible under the new writing, but not legible. And you can see this on this slide that I'm going to talk about next. What is visible is what you perceive immediately by the naked eye, but underneath, especially on the bottom, you see text running vertically. Because Sinai was quite isolated from the 7th to the 11th centuries, the reuse of parchment was often the only way to create new manuscripts. Faint traces of the original text often survive beneath the layered text on palimpsests, and in most cases, it is the original text, what we call the undertext, that is of greater interest to scholars. In this case, in what you see before you here on this slide, this is a palimpsest that comes from the British Library. So it's not part of the finds on the Monastery of St. Catherine, but I think it's an interesting one to look at, in that here we have both images are images of the same folio. And here to the left, you have what's, again, visible by the naked eye. And this is a 6th century palimpsest, unprocessed to the left. And once the same folio is processed, has gone through a series of processing, I should say, not just a kind of a single process, what is revealed as undertext is a text of Luke that by far predates the Syriac text on top. So the text of Luke has not been dated, but by the scribe, but kind of the scribal hand, it seems to be at least a few centuries earlier, to have been produced at least a few centuries earlier. To reveal the erased words on the palimpsest, scholars and scientists who are examining them work together under the guidance of a project director, usually a codicologist. The researchers begin by photographing each folio 12 times while it's illuminated with different colored visible light, ultraviolet light, and infracted light. Just want to kind of focus on this technology a little bit. Other images are taken with light shining from behind the page or off to one side of an oblique angle, helping to highlight the tiny bumps and depressions on the surface of the manuscript. Together, these photographs help reveal the minute traces of ink left on the pages after they were erased or the scratches left by the scribe's quill. Computer algorithms then analyze and combine the images so the text on top can be separated from the words below. These advances in manuscript processing have yielded information that has surprised not only the scholars examining these texts, but scholars across disciplines. This brings me back to the project itself and the Greek codex, whose finds bear evidence of the circulation of erotic fiction in 12th century Constantinople. In the time that remains, I want to address the work done on the Greek palimpsest that contains the poem and its ties to two Byzantine novels from different periods. The one I made reference to earlier, and I can go back to show you again. The first is a 12th century novel by Eustathios Makambolitis, a court poet, whose only production is this novel, Hismenia and Hismenias, and the other novel, that the particular poem that was discovered in the palimpsest, makes reference to, indirect reference to Libistor's and Rodanthe, which is a kind of an anonymous poet, an anonymous romance in verse that was written outside of Constantinople in the mid-13th century, a century after Hismenias was created. Then I will introduce a recent publication of a critical edition and translation of a 13th century romance whose original composition was influenced by the very author whose poetry appears in the palimpsest. So we have the palimpsest, we have, as I will show you later, Hismenia and Hismenias, which is the 12th century novel, and then a recent edition, critical edition and translation of a mid-13th century romance, Libistor's and Rodamne. And these are kind of the three texts I will be talking about, and the relationships that I note. The two developments, the digitizing of manuscripts at Sinai and the recent critical edition and translation of a 13th century romance, illuminate areas that were previously unknown to scholars, such as Byzantine reader tastes and sensibilities, and the influence of 12th century fiction in the second revival of the genre in the mid-13th and 14th century. For one, both developments, the translation and the new manuscript, that is the translation and the new manuscript find, place the reading of imaginative fiction in 12th century Byzantium in workshops, scriptoria, and monastic libraries inside of Constantinople, where one would expect to find them. They also point to the transfer of such literature beyond the bounds of urban centers, in monasteries, libraries, and courts in the periphery of the empire, such as Nicaea, North Africa, and the Arabic Peninsula. These discoveries raise important questions about the transfer of objects and ideas, their utility and preservation, and the travel of learning and information across continents and time. They also give us pause to consider our own relationship with the written word and the preservation and dissemination of texts, both literary and historical. And here I have questions of my own. I'm wondering, for example, what this poetry is doing in a collection. This is kind of the poetry that was just described, the erotic poem that was just described. What this poetry is doing in a collection otherwise rich in religious, medical, and liturgical texts. I'm also curious about the palimpsest's likely owner. Was he a known figure in the monastic community, or was the manuscript part of a priest's private library? Did it exist alongside other texts, and how did it arrive at Sinai? These are questions that have not been answered. I'm not even sure that they can be answered, but we certainly don't have enough evidence yet to consider them. I will begin by describing the two projects, and then I will turn to my research and its contribution to both. The Sinai Palimpsests Project uses the latest technologies in multispectral imaging to preserve and catalog manuscripts in rare collections. It is a collaboration among three players: the Early Manuscripts Electronic Library, which brings together scholars from European and North American universities to digitize manuscripts in private collections; the Monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt, which opened its collection to scholars for study; and the UCLA Library of Rare Texts and Manuscripts, which offers assistance with digitizing and cataloging the evidence in an online database. Scientists bring the latest advances in digital technology and spectral imaging to help the manuscript scholars uncover the layers of undertext in the scanned palimpsest folios. The goal of the project is threefold. First, to recover erased text with the help of multispectral imaging and other technologies. Then to identify the erased text and describe them paleographically. And last, to publish an online digital library of the palimpsests for scholarly access. The first phase of the project started in 2018 and concluded last year. It focused on digitizing and cataloging the monastery's Arabic and Syriac manuscripts, which are of crucial importance to linguists and classicists alike, as they preserve evidence from the transmission of Greek classical learning into Arabic. It is this very learning and meticulous preservation that saved ancient Greek manuscripts from destruction. These efforts in turn influenced the reading of the classics in the West. Without the translation of Greek originals into Syriac and Arabic, in other words, the place of Aristotle and Euripides would have been lost to us today. Similarly, we would not have knowledge of earlier scientific, medical, and philosophical treatises in Greek and other languages. The second phase of the project, perhaps I can show you this here, these phases, on this kind of the third bullet point. I have highlighted the second phase because it's of interest to me, but I'm covering it now. But the project comes in three phases. The second phase of the project focuses on the library's palimpsest, and this is the area that is of particular interest to me. The monastery's palimpsests contain texts in more than 10 languages. These are Georgian, Slavonic, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Palestinian Aramaic, Ethiopic, and Armenian. This phase is currently underway and sets to capture both the surface text on the page, which is the visible text, and the undertext on the folio scanned. The collection holds at least 160 palimpsests, a number only rivaled only by the holdings of the Vatican Library, whose palimpsests have not been made available for study, but it was recently reported that it is believed that the library holds at least twice the number of palimpsests, something that scholars had not realized when they started the digitization project. Let me see. Okay, this is Claudia Rapp here to your left, the codicologist, the project's director. And to the right, again, she's in the middle, and her Julia Rossetto, who's also presenting with her at various conferences, is pictured. And Father Justin, who is the lead figure in the monastery and a scholar in his own right, also travels frequently in the United States and gives lectures on the new finds. So far, based on information presented by the director of the project, Claudia Rapp, Professor Claudia Rapp, 310 erased texts have been identified in 74 palimpsests. That is about half of the palimpsests in the collection. The erased layers of writing preserve texts that date from the 5th to the 12th century. Of this work, three notable discoveries stand out. First, the recovery of the earliest surviving copies of text from the Hippocratic corpus. And this discovery demonstrates, on one hand, the unique level of erudition in the monastery, but it also yields new information to scholars who are interested in medicine and science. Next is the discovery of two previously unknown medical texts in classical Greek. And third, and most important to me, a large number of texts written in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, which is a language that fell out of use after the 12th century. Another near extinct language to reemerge from the parchments is Caucasian Albanian, which is a language that was spoken by a Christian kingdom in what is now modern-day Azerbaijan. Almost all written records from the Christian kingdom were lost between the 8th and the 9th century when its churches were destroyed. So this is a particularly valuable find for linguists, for ethnographers, historians, and literary scholars as well. An additional finding reported last year and the year before, last year in 2022, it was reported first in 2021 in the Byzantine Studies Conference that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. And there was an update on this finding in 2022 in the Byzantine Studies Conference that took place at UCLA in Los Angeles. The finding was evidence of erotic poetry in a palimpsest that was produced in a known scriptorium in Constantinople, and one that traveled from the capital to Sinai sometime shortly after its production in the 12th century. At the time, the city was at the height of its power and the center of culture and learning. Nevertheless, commissions of secular works were not popular, just as the writing of Romance fiction in Byzantium was not a standard element in literary culture. Storytelling was instead transmuted into stories about holy men and holy women. That is hagiography, not fiction. So the authors of the romances are important historical figures, but they're also pivotal in the transmission of fictional writing from the ancient to the modern world. As odd as the presence of erotic poetry in a monastic community may sound, even stranger is the production of such poetry in a known scriptorium in the capital that disclosed the poet's name. According to Claudia Rapp, who reported on the finds, the poet's name is clearly legible on the palimpsest and has been identified. This is Evstathio Makrambolidis, the author of Hysmenia and Hysmenias, the 12th century romance I made reference to earlier. One of the 4 points on, he's one of the 4 points poets on commission at the court of Manuel Komnenos and a skilled writer of poetry and oratory. He and another court writer by the name of Theodore Prodromos were composing with awareness of each other's work and were often in competition. To Makrambolidis, however, belongs the most popular of the 4 novels that survive from the period. Hysmenia and Hysmenias has been preserved in a relatively large number of manuscripts, 43 to be precise, of which only 9 can be considered Byzantine. Importantly, it contributed to the second revival of romance in the 14th century in centers of learning outside of Constantinople. What distinguishes this particular composition from the other novels that were produced during the period is its vivid erotic imagery, which usually comes in the form of detailed phrases of arts and dreams, and the poet's skill to draw compelling parallels between the discourse of desire in the novel and the imagery of subjection and torment as it emerges in historical and religious texts, including the New Testament. By the 13th century, Hysmenia and Hysmenias was not only well read, but also included in the compendia of Komnenian court rhetoric that were produced as part of the revival of learning fostered by the emperors in exile in Nicaea. The novel's influence continued uninterrupted in the centuries that followed, both in the East and in the West. Several scenes from the novel were adopted in the 14th century, were adopted by 14th century poet John Gower, and this is the English poet who's a near contemporary of Geoffrey Chaucer in his Confessio Amantis in Book 8. And by way of Gower's poetry, scenes from the novel form a portion of the plot of William Shakespeare's Pericles. This is specifically kind of noted in Act 3. Makrambolidis' novel also influenced the production of future romances in Greek. Here I have, let's see. Okay. Excuse me for a minute to find. This brings me to the second development I want to address, the publication of the first critical edition and translation of a romance that postdates both the manuscript find and the 12th century novel. This is the first critical edition translation of Livistros and Rhodamne, which is a mid-13th century romance. This romance bears similarities to Hismenia and Hismenius, and certainly there are traces of literary and aesthetic influence from the earlier novel. Livistros and Rhodamne, I have here a slide of the this particular publication has Hismenia and Hismenius, and it's a collection of the 12th century romances, and the one next to it is the recent publication. The critical edition translation next to it is the by the same translator, a publication of Livistros and Rhodamne in Greek. So Livistros and Rhodamne is a 13th century romance of about 4,700 verses that was written with the intention to be recited in front of an audience by an educated poet who was experienced in the Greek tradition of erotic fiction and in political discourse. Someone like Makramvolitis, in other words, the author of Hismenia and Hismenius. But Makramvolitis himself came from one of the elite families in Constantinople, which included several high-placed civil and ecclesiastical officials, and even an empress in the 11th century. Young men from such background were often the recipients of a thorough literary education. Evidence of this privilege is present in both compositions. The anonymous authors of Livistros follows the anonymous author of Livistros follows in the footsteps of Makramvolitis, at least his literary footsteps, in that he borrows and adopts tropes and motifs from the novel of his predecessor. He shows knowledge of medieval French troubadour poetry and Persian romance. He acts out in the plot a fluid setting, and that includes Latins, Armenians, Persians, and Egyptians. And in doing so, he creates new techniques and new poetics, I have argued, while acknowledging earlier literary and aesthetic sensibilities that are fundamentally Byzantine. The anonymous poetry of Livistros also negotiates political power through the personification of Eros, the classical god of love, who's presented as a formidable king surrounded by an impressive retinue and an affluent court. If for most medievalists, the very existence of erotic literature in Byzantium appears as something quite inconceivable because we have learned to associate the culture of Byzantium with the ecclesiastical aspects of Christianity, the recent discovery of erotic poetry at Sinai asks that we take another look at our certitudes. The erotic poetry in the manuscript validates the importance of fiction in Byzantine life and its appreciation beyond the empire and its orthodox norms in monastic settings as far out as North Africa. This development comes as no surprise to scholars of Byzantine poetics who have argued that fiction and romance in particular flourished alongside other genres in Byzantium from the 11th century on and continued to evolve well after the fall of the empire in the 15th century in the periphery of the empire, in the islands, in Crete, in Venice, and now apparently Sinai. The Sinai Palimpsests bears witness to the important scribal activity undertaken in the monastery of St. Catherine, but also shows us that traditions of learning continued uninterrupted in a world that was far more connected, curious, and tolerant than scholars have been willing to admit. To a literary scholar like myself, the discovery of erotic poetry at Sinai provides material proof of the importance of creative fiction in religious centers within and outside the capital from the 12th century forward. It also tells us, or rather reminds us, of the vulnerability of texts and their scant or inconsistent preservation. We know for sure that as valuable as the Greek palimpsest that contains the poetry was to its original patron and owner, it did not remain important to its future holders. The manuscript was at some point erased to accommodate new tastes and needs. If erasing an ancient text today seems an incalculable loss to a 12th century scribe or an earlier scribe, it was likely an act of devotion and even a measure of progress. A text that had gone unread for a generation or more could easily provide a scriptorium with material for the production of a new manuscript, a holy manuscript perhaps, that could enrich countless spiritual lives. Thankfully today, due to advances in science and scholarship, we are in a position to recover lost histories, sensibilities, and new communities that made important literary and spiritual contributions during their respective times. The findings from the palimpsests allow past voices, such as the voice of a 12th century Greek poet, to speak again through poetry, and also reveal to us that secular literature was indeed popular during the Middle Ages, even in Byzantium, even in a monastic setting. It was certainly considered important enough to have been commissioned, preserved, cherished, and then transferred to Sinai. Thank you very much for listening to me and for your patience. So this brings me to the conclusion of my talk.
Thank you, Christina. If we could take down the PowerPoint, please. So again, thank you, Christina, very much for your very interesting talk, which raises lots of questions in my mind about cultural exchange between East and West, the dissemination of literature, and of course, this fascinating story of discovery using modern technologies to reveal these lost texts. I'm sure there are questions out there in our audience. Just to repeat what we said before, we'd like to request that people type their questions into the chat, and then we will read them to our speaker in the order in which they are received. So if you have a question for Professor Christoforatou, could you please type it into the chat, and we will read it out for our entire audience, and so that Professor Christoforatou can respond. So please type your questions into the chat. We have our first question, which is from Professor Mark Lewis. And Professor Lewis writes, "Thanks for explaining these palimpsests and your research. Could you share with us a translated passage of some of this erotic poetry, maybe by Macrambolites, and give us your interpretation of its meaning?"
Well, thank you for this question. This is the incredible thing. I have not seen this poem. It is truly stunning that the name, first of all, that the name of the author was reported. And so this erotic poetry has been reported as existing, has been credited to Evstathios Macrambolites. And I ask explicitly because it's remarkable that we have anything else outside of Hismenia's credit to him. But the scholars have not reached the point where anything has come, to us, to literary scholars in print, right? So the only thing that has been reported of the finds in this Greek palimpsest is that this is indeed erotic poetry. It is credited to Macrambolites. The manuscript was a commissioned manuscript, an expensive manuscript produced in a Constantinopolitan scriptorium in the 12th century, and at some point reached the monastery shortly after its production. It stayed there, but we have no other information about the kind of the pilgrim or the person who brought it to the monastery. So I have nothing to report about the contents of this poem, but I have a lot to say about Macrambolitis and his use of eroticism in his Mini and his Minias. And I have also kind of published and argued in my own scholarship that this is the kind of the most defining literary feature of his prose, his kind of ability to weave together erotic torment with political repression and all other types of repression, kind of bringing together eroticism and politics. And I believe, you know, from my study of the other romances, that this is something that authors who post-date Macrambolitis, like the anonymous poet of Lévi-Strauss and Rodamni, are looking back and try to emulate and do emulate in their own verse romances. So just to clarify, do you want me to sort of make a reference to Macrambolitis' use of eroticism, saying his Mini and his Minias, or was that a kind of a question about sort of verses from the poem that has been discovered?
Yes, I'd still be interested in hearing a section of his mania and whatever you would like to say about it. That would be maybe that would help the students understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so can I share, let me just do this, because I had prepared some slides anticipating this question, right? How does a 12th century poet do this, right? How does he kind of address eroticism or romance or kind of creates characters, you know, who fall in love or in lust, and then makes these connections, right, with politics or with religious repression, whatever have you. So I have prepared a couple of slides that I can share that shows you how the language of erotic desire translates into torment in a kind of in a religious context and then in a political context. Is it okay to share? Or do you think that takes us up? Yeah, all right. So let's go back. Let me go back. Okay, here's the PowerPoint. Let's share it again. All right, so let me start with this slide here. So this is a this is kind of a linguistic search. A few years back, I started reading his Mini and his Minias out loud. I had known the novel for quite some time, but it's still, I just felt that a lot escaped me from the novel. I knew that not his Mini and his Minias, but the other three novels that were composed around the same time were also performed. So they were kind of meant for entertainment, but they were also performed for the court, and they were very popular. And Eleanor of Aquitaine actually saw a performance of two of them. His Mini and his Minias was never performed. But when you read the language in the original Greek, there's a word emphasis in the kind of the language of bondage and the language of submission. And so when I tracked, as I was reading words, specifically stems, because, you know, by the mid-12th century, the language also kind of changes, and a lot of compound words begin to enter the Greek vocabulary. So when I was doing a track of these words that reveal repression, this is just one compound, right? One stem that starts with this particular stem here to the right, thu, which means it's part of it is the stem for the word submission. So these are just one reference of various words in books. They appear a lot more frequently. But we have subscribe into submission, doulographite, doulographizo. The first is the passive voice. Book 3, you use it in, the use is in the active voice. Subscribe someone into a slave is this one here. I subscribe myself into a slave is this one in book 4. I draw myself into slavery along with someone else. And so these are just kind of the first reference, right, of compound words that bear these stem. Then some other references. Let me see if this would be a good one. This is how Eros is, the god of love, who is portrayed in the novel as a sovereign figure, is performing his own sort of cosmic sovereignty. There is a scene in the novel where the two lovers look at an artwork on a frieze, and they engage in a kind of exegesis, an interpretation of the art before them. And as they're looking at this work of art, they begin to sort of, debate its meaning. The same night, the hero has a dream, and in his dream, this is what emerges. So we go from the observation of the artwork, its interpretation, which continue to haunt the principal character, Hysmenius, in his dream. And in the dream, this is what he experiences. Eros calling upon him and saying, bring me the usurper, him who is unafraid of the liberated master, the master who causes ours to shake. Bring to me the man who is unafraid of my wings, who reviles my fire, who is embarrassed of my nakedness, who exhibits scorn towards me for being young. And this is pretty stereotypical of mid and late Byzantine iconography of power. And it was also part of Manuel Komnenos' political iconographic repertoire, but it portrays here Eros as a master, right? As a master under whose kind of orders are the principal characters, who fall in love. Again, these part of the stem that I was talking about, the having to do with slavery appears here, right? Bring me the usurper. So the principal character, Hysmenius, as someone who threatens the agency and the sovereignty of Eros. Now, this is interesting. This is where we get into kind of religious territory and a religious text. There is a part in the novel in Hysmenia and Hysmenius where the stem du lographo, subscribing to submission, which is seen here, is paired up with another word that appears in Greek only in the New Testament, and specifically to, I think it's the first epistle to the Corinthians attributed to Paul. And here, in the Corinthians, Paul makes a reference to discipline and how the faithful have a duty to bring desire into submission. This is kind of a reference to marriage, and Paul receives a letter from a community whose denizens want to know what they can do so, to remain faithful to their spouses. So Paul writes back and makes this analogy and says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Now, in the original, these two words that I this phrase here, bring into subjection and I discipline, in the original Greek appear exactly in that form in Hysmenia and Hysmenius. I have traced these words in all kinds of lexicons and sources, and they appear nowhere else. So now the task is to figure out whether these words were written in other sources or were used by other authors at the time when Makrimpolitis is writing. And when I looked at historical records or other texts that Makrimpolitis would have had access to, I was able to find one. And this is a very well-known history by Nikitas Phoniatis, a near contemporary of our author of Macrambolitis, who also makes reference to submission, right, in much the same way. And so I have been able, in other words, to show in my own writing, in my own scholarship, that at least to Byzantine court writers who had an obligation to write for influential patrons, if not Manuel Komnenos, his aristocratic circle, but most likely Manuel, because Manuel was known to be a patron of incredibly skilled poets who had to do his bidding. So this is sort of proof that fiction existed in the court, but it also existed alongside histories, and it was influenced by histories, but also by religious texts and commentaries, and the language of subjection that is very that's well established in the New Testament, throughout the New Testament, appears in a historical text, but also in a romance, in the same way, to draw kind of parallels between the kind of an individual's subjection to a sovereign, and the subjection that the faithful owe, to a divine authority.
Thank you, Christina. Christina, I wonder if I could follow up on what Professor Lewis has asked, and bearing in mind that most people in our audience are not specialists in Byzantine literature, how then would you define what you are calling erotic poetry in a Byzantine context?
Well, I haven't called the poem that was discovered erotic because I haven't seen it yet. So it's interesting to see. That's a very good question, right? So when this new finding in the palimpsest was called erotic poetry, right? But what qualified it as such, right? Because by comparison to what is available in the 12th century romances and the 14th century successors, as well as their predecessors of both, the Greek and Roman novels that flourished in 4th century Alexandria, what is considered erotic in this palimpsest may not be as erotic, right? And so in the Byzantine novels and romances, eroticism can be explicit, right? We have the principal characters, we have a hero and heroine who long for each other, who get separated, long for each other, but they also lust, right, for each other, both the female heroine and the male protagonist. And in fact, what is really kind of entertaining, especially not so much in Hismenia, well, not so much in Hismenia and Hismenias, but in Drusilla and Charicles by Nikitas Eugenianos, is that the heroine is far more proactive and far more sort of centered and aware, both of reality, but also her own prospects of the male character. So gender is very important in all of these compositions, as are gender roles, right? And in terms of the awareness of the principal characters of, sexuality and kind of erotic agency, you may say, that varies from novel to novel. But of all the novels, all 9 of them, it is Hismenia and Hismenias that gives us a very bold heroine who negotiates her own agency, both personal and political, and a principal hero, a principal character, Hismenias, who challenges Eros' sovereignty. So we have the kind of the erotic or sexual play between the hero and the heroine, but we also have the hero challenging Eros, because Hismenias doesn't want to be tied down. He doesn't want to be married to Hismene, And so he curses Eros, right, for making him fall in love with her, because he doesn't have the courage to let his Mini down because he likes her. So he sees Eros as a tormentor, a welcome tormentor on one hand, but also as a slave master. So on one hand, he desires his Mini, but he didn't ask to desire her, and holds Eros responsible for his torments. So at the end, near the end of the novel, near the end of His Mini and His Minias, things get really heated and really political, because his Mini is out of the picture now, and the principal character is angered with Eros and his sovereignty.
Thank you. Please type your questions into the chat and we will read them out. Joe, do you want to take this question from Professor Wing?
Just saw it pop up. Professor John Wayne says, thank you, Professor. More of a technical question. Did you mention when, if known, the erasure of erotic poetry took place? What are the major challenges in determining the chronology of the changes made to the palimpsests?
Yeah, I have no idea. And this is kind of the maddening part of this, that scholars are salivating for information, right? And Professor Raab and those working with her and the scientists and the technicians are in a mad race trying to produce, results. But if you take into account, how long it takes to even scan and to sort of process an individual folio, you come to realize that there's no way that we're going to get results in the next even 5 years, right? The process is really time consuming. But the fact that this finding was reported is really remarkable. And what else was reported alongside with what I noted today is that this comes from a collection of writings. So probably we're looking at a palimpsest and a florilegium, right? A kind of an anthology. And the anthology is also rich in other secular writings, which there was no reporting on this. I don't know if they were not deemed important or there wasn't enough information, but it would be fascinating when more gets disclosed to kind of look at this poem in relationship to other writings in the collection, but also to see what codicologists, because I'm not a codicologist, it's almost like being an archaeologist and a historian, or bundled in one, and a scientist, can tell us about timing. We don't know when, at least I don't know when the poem was erased in order for the new text to be written. I don't even know what was written on top of it, right? Obviously, I think what was reported, and I recall this clearly because I asked the question, is of greater worth rather was the undertext, which was this poem credited to Macrambolitis.
Thank you. Please type your questions in the chat. Actually, Christina, could you please fill in for the audience a little bit about the background, the career of Macrambolitis, who he was, his importance in the imperial court of Byzantium?
I know you probably know more about him as a historical figure. I know him more as a jobbing poet. So literary scholars usually study the work of the first four poets in conversation with one another. The four poets that wrote in the 12th century, I'm sorry about this, let me just kind of bring them up here, one of whom is Macrambolitis, knew of each other. For example, Prodromos and Macrambolitis, as I mentioned, work alongside each other. One may have kind of instructed the other in some way, and I can't remember. Most likely it was Prodromos who instructed Macrambolitis. But of the four, it is Macrambolitis who appears the most learned and the most skilled, the most adaptable. It's his poetry that is richest and also most innovative in terms of the influences that it absorbs from earlier Greek works, but also from Western European romances and troubadour poetry. He's remarkably flexible, inventive, and I have argued this is one of the reasons that his poetry was so widely read, but also translated, right, in the West, in the 14th century. And then we also have manuscripts that show us that Hismenias was read well and translated well into the 18th century. I'm trying to think what else. He was certainly he was certainly very well connected with the court, but nevertheless, he was like the other fellows. He was a jobbing poet. He never resided in the court, but he wrote extensively for the court. Of what he may have produced, we only have Hismenia and Hismenias. And so when this new find was announced, our antennas went up, because this is the one poet who really stands out as someone who would have made kind of remarkable contributions, not only to our literary knowledge, but to our knowledge of politics. Something I didn't mention in my talk, but I have explored extensively in my previous scholarship, is that all four of these poets are not just writing for the court. They're writing for themselves, and they're writing to, of course, please the court, and they follow the demands of a patron, but they also extensively and intentionally criticize court policies and the abuse of power. And this kind of discourse, which I'm beginning to tease out in my monograph, is really deep and reveals a kind of conversation among these poets about political violence, political power. It's not easy to tease out, but it's important to do so because we know all four of them recited their poetry to one another. I mean, you need to think of them as sort of poets in a salon of sorts. So there were gatherings where they shared their poetry, and other times when they competed with one another for commissions and for money that came from the court, but prestige as well. So they had this kind of love-hate relationship, which is kind of great to follow. And historically, we just don't know very much, because even the dating of the first four novels is uncertain.
That's very interesting. So in a way, this can be sort of veiled, as you said, political critique. And we know from other sources, I mean, we've talked about this before, for example, the history compiled by the Byzantine bureaucrat, historian Nikitas Konyatis, and you showed an excerpt from him a few moments ago. He's very critical of the court, the imperial court in Constantinople, which particularly the reign of the emperor, whose reign falls across the dates of your poets here on the screen. That, you know, at the time these poets are active, you know, we're talking about the reign of the emperor Manuel I Komnenos, and you know, his court was almost notorious for its relaxed sexual mores.
Oh, it wasn't just relaxed. I mean, Manuel was commissioning Manuel was very, very proactive in commissioning poetry and art that presented him as incredibly virile and quite forward in a number of ways. But Manuel's sexuality was not to be trifled with. And so what we observe in these moments, you know, in kind of a crisis in the novels, is it's sort of a nod to that desire, right, to see a sovereign figure in the first four novels, the 12th century novels, that would be Eros, right? Eros the king, as a new Manuel, right? A new paradigm of power, who is kind of sexually forward, but also very competent and sometimes protective of the lovers, right? The principal characters in these novels. But there is another Prodromos, not Theodore Prodromos, who kind of produced extensive poetry for manual, where the figure of Eros is explicitly compared to the emperor. So all of these poets, these four poets, are aware of the temperament of the emperor, of course, right? The kind of the wider sort of the desires that he has to see himself, identified, with lasting figures of power. But at the same time, the same words or imagery that they use to elevate this image can be found, right, in religious or political contexts, in histories, or in the New Testament. I showed in Paul, in the Corinthians, in contexts that reveal a kind of sort of explicit abuse, right? The abuse of the flesh, the abuse of the kind of the political subject. And so as they're flattering manual, they're also criticizing the abuse of power, whether that be religious or political.
Fascinating.
And they can do both, and they do both very well, which kind of reveals that, something, the poetry that was found in the palimpsest, right, could have been of great use to the monks in the monastery, right? Because there are kind of many references in the New Testament, but also in the spiritual life of the monks about, about the follies of the flesh, right? About desire, the tempering of desire. And what I increasingly see in my own work is that the two align, right? The kind of the tempering of desire, the tempering of the body, with the tempering of the kind of the civic body, when it must endure.
Thank you. Other questions, please? I wonder if there are some people in the audience who are knowledgeable about Western medieval romance and can bring to bear any questions as a comparison to the Byzantine romances. So anyway, out there, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat.
Well, the Romance of the Rose, since you brought it up, I have to say this: for many years, Byzantinists were absolutely haunted by this question of influence, which didn't serve us very well, Eric, as you know, which is, which came first, right? Because these romances were written at the same time that Eleanor was sort of commissioning her own wonderful romances in the West. The imagery of desire, the iconography of Eros in the 12th century novels became the locus of contestation, right? Of figuring out whether this iconography of desire originated in Byzantium, in imperial and literary circles, and then was adopted by Western poets and Western sources, namely the Romance of the Rose, right, with its two poets, or whether the influence worked the other way around from the West East. Ultimately, I think it doesn't quite matter, because there were so many opportunities for for cross-cultural influence that didn't serve as well, kind of digging and in part this sort of inquiry had to do with an effort to try to date the novels more accurately, but somehow we lost sight of literature.
Thank you. Joe, we have another question. Would you like to take it?
This is from Professor Mark Lewis, and his question is: from the romantic novels, romances, can you ascertain the attitude of the Byzantine nobility in the 12th to 15th centuries toward extramarital sex? Was it considered permissible, contrary to correct Christian teaching, as it reportedly was in Italy in the 14th century?
This is a good one. So there's only one thing that I can say with certainty, which is in the 12th century novels, all four novels end with marriage, right? Even the ones who are not complete make reference to marriage as an end, right? And the principal characters do not consummate their relationship. They they return, they're homebound. I mean, they kind of, they're shipwrecked, but eventually return home, wherever that home is. It's usually within the Levant. And once they return home, there's kind of matrimony, attention to matrimonial rituals. And so, you know, there's no extramarital anything there, but there's a lot of fantasizing, there's a lot of dreaming, there's a lot of lusting, there's a lot of humor as well, because as I noted, it seems to be that it's the heroine who is deeply concerned, but also deeply aware of the dangers of an extramarital affair, being that you know, the goal of both characters is to return home. So how the heroine manages to rein her beloved in is really interesting and humorous in all four novels. But in the 14th century compositions, those that were written from the mid-13th century on, all bets are off. There are no restrictions, and there's something more liberating there. And scholars have argued that this kind of spirit of liberation, both kind of personal and erotic, has to do with influences from Arabic romances and Persian romances that attended more to the kind of the supernatural, the magical even. And so the kind of the 13th and 14th century romances are more satisfying in that way. In reference to the 12th century romances, there's greater attention to ritual, to propriety, to decorum, right? But not consistently, right? So the end result is marriage. But along the way, there are all these efforts to subvert the agency of Eros, or the kind of the torments of Eros, right? And the novel that is most subversive in that way in its discourse, but also in its imagery, is Hysmene and Hysmenius. And that's why I'm so hyped about this new finding, because if of these four poets, we could single out one who would be most skilled and most adept at giving us sort of parallels, you know, between the erotic and the political, that would be Makrim Boulitis.
Thank you. Other questions, please?
I should also say that these novels are very teachable. I teach them and students love them. They have great fun with them, and they're actually surprised that the characters in these novels are so humorous and just relatable. And they, I think I showed you this slide, but if you have an interest here, these two are relatively recent translations. I should also say that I started studying these romances in the original when they had not been translated yet. But since 2012, we have a new translation of the 12th century novels by Elizabeth Jeffreys. And then just last year, 2021, rather, the end of 2021, Panayotis Agapitos, who produced the first critical edition of Lévi-Strauss, also produced a critical edition translation of the romance, and it took him 10 years to produce it. I was at a symposium with him in Athens when he announced his intention. It was announced, I don't think he was there, it was announced on his behalf. And then 10 years later, this masterpiece arrived, and it's not, this is the actual book, so it's not as voluminous as this, which is the critical edition. But the language of the romance is so rich and so beautiful and so lyrical that it presents a great challenge to anyone who can actually talk about it in English, but also read it in Greek to translate it. But he has done a masterful job. I invite you to look at it. I reviewed this translation recently for Speculum, so the translation is there if you're kind of curious about the romance itself and the tradition. But it's very teachable and students love it.
Christina, you mentioned the performative aspects of these works, that they were read aloud, or even acted out, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah.
At the court. Do you do that with your students?
The students do it for us. They have to deliver panel presentations, kind of formal, like this one. And they're free to choose whatever aspect of the work to remark upon, right, in a kind of an extensive presentation. And not very far back, there was a panel of students who decided to focus on something. It was a little dark. It was plenty dark, rather, but they found it. They found it moving. There's a scene in Drusilla and Charicles by Nikitas Eugenianos where there's sort of a festive occasion where the characters delight and make fun, make light of one another. And there is a woman, an older woman, who kind of tries to participate in the festivities, and she's ridiculed. And the principal character is absolutely cruel to her. And this scene is an extensive scene of several hundred lines. So 3 students in a panel kind of, took on that scene and read out loud with intention and kind of engaged in interpretation, but not truly kind of a performance of sorts. But all 4 novels, the 12th century novels, are very performative. By contrast, the 14th century works are more lyrical and more whimsical almost.
That sounds a lot of fun. I'll have to try that on my students.
This is the reporting from the students' perspective. I've also taught De Genis Acritas, which is a kind of an 11th century epic romance that predates Drusilla and Charicles, and they find this wild because it's just so overt, but they also delight in the novels in Drusilla and Charicles.
Oh, we have actually, Joe, you have a question. You might as well read it yourself.
On the 4 Byzantine novels that you have up on the screen there, that last one, I remember reading that years ago as an undergrad. When was that first translated to English, in the 17th century? And if so,
are you talking about Drusilla and Charicles, or
yes, yes.
Oh, you may have. There's another before the translation by Elizabeth Jeffreys, an American scholar, John Burton, who's wonderful, produced this translation. I don't know if you had this one. This is also very teachable and very fine translation. And unlike Jeffreys' translation, you have to forgive my notes here. We have the kind of the Greek on one side. I'm sorry about this. It's terrible.
Okay.
The Greek on one side and the translation on the other side. So maybe this is what you were referring to. But it's rare to find. So this made the novel teachable. So for a very long time, these novels had not been translated, right? And scholars, and it was terrible for scholars too, because imagine what we would have of Dante if we didn't have Dante in translation, right? It's fabulous to be able to kind of read Dante in the original and write scholarship in the original. But we would have been a lot poorer without Dante in translation, right? Or Boccaccio in translation. So this edition by Burton, which was produced in 2004, was the very first translation of the 12th century Byzantine novel.
Well, my further question would be, I'm always interested in how this could have influenced the development of the English novel, which then could have its influence later on in American literature.
Oh my goodness. I have no idea, Joe. I just,
Okay.
one of the points that I made in my paper is that we shouldn't say couldn't have, right? Because what material evidence reveals to us in literary evidence is that readers and poets and writers have always been very curious of the work of their peers, right? Or reading done in other countries and in other communities. I'm teaching Chaucer this semester, and he's very much in my mind, and also kind of Chaucer's curiosity about his Italian peers, right? Of Boccaccio, of the Tesaida, of Chaucer kind of being sent on diplomatic trips and seeking out connections, right? With his intellectual interlocutors and his equals. And seeking out these travels, not necessarily to support himself because he had secured a good stipend by, the third diplomatic trip, but to kind of make these connections, right? So it is sometimes as scholars, we fail to recognize how much of our endeavors, as creative minds, revolve around opportunities to make connections, right? Intellectual connections with other individuals. In the context of the court, there would be many opportunities for such connections because there were also empresses who were not Greek, right? Who were German, right? Who were French. So they would bring with them, right, this culture, but also the means to transmit them to a Greek court. But travel also. More direct, I think more direct connections from the Greek world to the English novel must have come by way of translation of these novels, or the earlier novels, the Greek and Roman novels that were written in post-Roman Alexandria, through either Italian or French sources, but not through Greek sources directly. I sincerely doubt it. However, we do know that Hismenian Hismenius was that John Gower had knowledge of Hismenian Hismenius, and of all the novels, this was the one that had the most kind of lasting influence in the West. But even scholars like Ingela Nilsson have not been able to sort of nail that influence somewhere.
Fascinating. I mean, I was very interested in, Christina, you mentioned influence scenes indeed from one of these novels making its way into Shakespeare's play Pericles.
Yeah, and this is remarkable because it arrives at Pericles, I think it's Act 3, not through the original, not through through Gower. So Gower must have gotten this material, this particular scene. It's kind of Hismeni being adrift at sea, right? And you may figure, you could have gotten this scene from any saint's life, from any kind of religious reference. Like I'm thinking about Griselda at sea, right? All these heroines in the Canterbury Tales or in other works where they find themselves adrift, or where they're put in a rudderless vessel right out at sea. It's kind of a topos, and Gower could have gotten from any source really. There was not a scarcity of kind of Latin or English or French sources. But it is this novel, Hismenian Hismenias, that features into the Confessio Amantis in the 8th book, and then it is through the Confessio Amantis that Shakespeare is drawing his information.
Fascinating. It's 3:30. So any final question before we close our lecture this afternoon and thank our speaker? Any further questions?
I think I'm going to stop the share because I can't even see you.
There we go.
So much better. Thank you.
Any final questions for Professor Christoforatou?
Can I say 2 things? I'm so touched that there are 19 people here, including myself, but I'm sincerely touched that you elected to spend this glorious afternoon on Zoom with me and not outdoors. A terrible thing, I think. It's a beautiful day.
Oh,
but
no.
I sincerely thank you.
Well, as I said, Christina, I hope there's many beautiful days out there waiting for us, but you don't often have the chance to, as the Byzantines would say, dance in the garden of the muses with these manuscripts, and for you to share with us your incredibly learned analysis of these materials, and to show all these amazing interconnections between the Byzantine literary world of the Middle Ages and the broader medieval, even today's modern world.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's kind of like, as I'm kind of laughing in my head because I'm thinking so much of it is also speculation, right? Because but what I describe here is just kind of hinges on this announcement, right? That it was on kind of it was bold, it was certain, but we know nothing else, right, about what constitutes erotic poetry or what is erotic to someone kind of reading this excerpt of this poem for the first time. But usually, I mean, this is the messiness of scholarship at the beginning sometimes, right? But we're still kind of very I don't know, very grateful, right, to these vast collaborations, right, to have technicians and technology and science and manuscript, you know, scholars work side by side to do this kind of work.
Thank you. I think that's the excitement of this cutting edge of scholarship at the moment, that, you know, we have the happy confluence of scholars, technology, and the excitement of these new discoveries. And, you know, clearly from what you say, there's more to discover. We will learn more about this text and many other texts, which I hope.
Something, yeah.
Others.
Something, and I'm going to leave you with that, but something that's really mind-blowing to the way that things get done differently now, like thinking about it, that catechologists never used to work, you know, with so many other, you know, helpers, right, and experts to guide them. But now the catechologist is the one that sort of guides the work, but then it's off hands after that plan has been outlined, and other experts come in to do their part, and this expedites, right, the kind of the study of manuscripts. But as new finds get discovered, it slows down the kind of the presentation, the formal presentation, whether kind of it's in print or some digital portal of the finds. But I have to say the team is extraordinary in that they're always report about new finds and conferences, and so that's the great part.
Thank you. And it's very useful for, I know some of my students are out there in the audience, they now know how essentially history, literature studies, all these fields, there are new things to discover, there are exciting discoveries to be made.
Yeah, and I think students appreciate this, because I always say, you know, you're on TikTok, you're here and there and on social media, but you know, this is how people have always thought. The medieval imagination is always synthetic and pluralistic, I feel, right? That may kind of, we have poets and artists and writers who you know, who make all these connections, these fluid connections, even in the context of repression, between political repression and sexual repression, right? Between desire and torment. And so all these sort of, you may call them binaries, or these kind of antitheses come together, right? And so, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christina, very much. I hope everyone will join me in saying thank you to Professor Christoforatou very much for sharing her really interesting research, and we wish it every success. And it sounds like there's a lot more to find out, a lot more to discover.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, everyone. So for those students who are seeking blue credit, take note of the message in the chat. And beyond that, I'd just like to thank our speaker again. I'd like to thank Professor Christoforatou for very kindly speaking to us today and presenting this really interesting cutting edge research. I'd like to thank everybody who has attended for their for joining us this afternoon and for their very interesting questions. As I said, this is the last lecture in the spring 2023 lecture series. A new series of lectures will be announced in due course for the fall 2023 semester. So in the meantime, I thank you all for your attendance, for your attention, and I wish everybody a very happy and successful end to the spring semester. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.